tal, jóvenes? Muy buenas noches. Vamos a dar inicio al evento de esta noche, en donde nos sentimos sumamente halagados de que el Fondo Monetario Internacional nos haya invitado al ITAM como anfitriones para este evento. Vamos a hacer la presentación de nuestros participantes de este del día de hoy en inglés. Debo decirles, antes de iniciar, que el evento es un esfuerzo del Fondo Monetario Internacional de reunirse con audiencias jóvenes, con estudiantes como ustedes, con otros más, puesto que este evento se transmite todo el mundo a través de Cybercast. La idea es tener un contacto con ustedes, poder compartir puntos de vista, entender el rol del Fondo Monetario Internacional, lo que piensa el Fondo Monetario Internacional sobre la situación actual del mundo, etcétera. De manera que este evento se va a repetir también en otros países, en Perú, en Chile, pero nos sentimos muy halagados de que este evento que se realice en México haya sido aquí. So thank you very much to the International Monetary Fund for this event. It is indeed a great honor for ITAM to host it. So let me move now to present today's participants. First, let me introduce Mr. David Lipton, who is the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund since September 2011. Prior to this, he served as a Special Advisor to the Managing Director at the Fund. Before coming to the Fund, Mr. Lipton was Special Assistant to the President and served in the White House as Senior Director for International Economic Affairs at the National Economic Council and the National Security Council. Previous to this, Mr. Lipton was a Managing Director at Citi, and before that he has another experience in the financial sector. Mr. Lipton also served at the Clinton administration Treasury Department from 1993 to 1998 as Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs. Prior to this, Mr. Lipton was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. I should just mention as well that David Lipton earned a PhD and a Master's in Economics from Harvard University. It is also a great pleasure for us to welcome this evening Professor Nouriel Roubini, who is co-founder and chairman of Nouriel Roubini Global Economics, an independent global macroeconomic strategy research firm. Especially since the financial crisis of 2008, Nouriel Roubini's comments have been widely reproduced and by most of the international media, Business Week, Forbes, Wall Street Journal. In addition of running this very successful macroeconomic advice company, Professor Roubini is a professor of macroeconomics at New York University's Stern School of Business. He's had extensive policy experience as well as broad academic credentials. He's been part of a White House Council of Economic Affairs. He's been senior advisor to the Treasury Department, as well as to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Professor Roubini has published over 70 theoretical and policy papers, as well as been co-author of various books, Political Cycles, Theory and Evidence, Bailouts and Bail-ins, Responding to the Financial Crisis in Emerging Markets, and Crisis Economics, a crash course in the future of finance. Professor Roubini has an undergraduate degree from Bocconi University at Milan, and a doctorate in economics also from Harvard University. He was part of Yale University faculty prior to joining NYU. We are very pleased as well to have as a moderator today a good friend of ITAM, Leo Zuckermann, Leo Zuckermann is a professor of political science at CIDE and a well-known journalist in Mexico. Leo Zuckermann received an undergraduate degree in public administration from Colegio de Mexico, and afterwards a master's in public policy from the University of Oxford in England, as well as master's degree from Columbia University. He's had various experience both in consulting firms as McKinsey as well as a government in Mexico. But over the last few years, Leo Zuckermann has distinguished himself as a leading journalist in Mexico. His column in Excelsior is well known, Juegos de Poder. He also participates as a daily news and commentator in Grupo Fórmula Radio. On television, currently he holds a program Entre los Tres and TV Azteca, and he's also an analyst and commentator from Televisa news programs. In 2003, he received the National Journalism Award for the best feature article, Líderes Mexicanos magazine, ranking him as well as one of the 300 leaders in Mexico. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before we start our panel, let me note that this event is webcast live, and there is an active Twitter account. There is this hashtag Pregunta al FMI, where you can send all of your questions that you might have for Dr. Roubini and Dr. Lipton. My personal Twitter is Leo Zuckermann with double N at the end, so I'm going to be checking the hashtag Pregunta al FMI and my personal account to see all of your questions. Let me start asking Dr. Roubini, why are you here? Why did you come to Mexico? And I understand that then you are going to Peru and then and Chile. Why the IMF is coming suddenly to Mexico to meet with the students? What's going on?
I've always wanted to be Nouriel Roubini. I'm David Lipton. I'm the #2 at the IMF. We've taken this opportunity to set up this trip to have a chance, turn it down a little please, to have a chance to speak with young people in Latin America about the IMF, to try to explain what we do, to try to understand what's interesting and important to you in your futures, and how try to explain to you ways in which I think the IMF will be important to your future. So we're doing this kind of a forum here. We're doing it in Lima. We're doing it in Santiago in the course of the week. You may know we're also sponsoring an essay contest. You can write an essay on some of these subjects that we're discussing. There'll be information about that on our website, imf.org. The contest will be open for submissions for the second half of March, and I encourage you to do that. You know, the IMF is an international organization with 188 member countries. Our job is to help all of those countries work together to promote global growth, to promote international financial stability, and to help any country along the way that gets into financial trouble. And you might ask why that's relevant to you. And let me say a few words. Thinking about Mexico, you know, some of you who are economics students will know that economists often ask the question, what is a country's comparative advantage? And I think one of the most, maybe the most important comparative advantage in Mexico is youth, is you. There's a huge number of young people in Mexico, a higher percentage of people under the age of 25 than in many other countries in the region, certainly than in the United States. And this is a source of strength. First, you avoid a weakness that many countries have, where the aging of population, the prevalence of older people, is a heavy burden on the working population. You won't have that. But also, you'll have so many people who are young, innovative, creative, and who have a chance to make something, not just of their lives, but of their country. So first, I would say, obviously, you're here to get a good education. That's important. Second, when you're done, take control of your country. You have a government that's just instituted a whole huge, basically a generation's worth of reforms. But reforms aren't made or broken in a day. They require years of refinement, implementation. If these reforms, which I think have the chance to really greatly improve the functioning of this economy, to create more job opportunities, to make opportunities not just for you but for your children. That's important. But third, and a piece that you might not think about, in this global economy with so much interconnectedness, another thing that really matters for your future is what happens in the rest of the world. You may think primarily of the connections between the US and Mexico, or the competition from China with Mexico. But really, events that happen all over the world can either help you grow, if the rest of the world is vibrant and buying Mexican goods, or it can cause problems if there are financial crises that interfere with trade and with finance. And that's where we come in, because our job is to work with all of the countries of the world to try to get those countries to pursue smart policies, to avoid risks that might lead to crisis, to get countries to recognize that some of what they do spills over and affects other countries and could damage them. We've spent a lot of time, for example, talking about U.S. monetary policy and how it affects emerging market countries. We've seen quite a lot of talk about that in the last year, and that affects Mexico as well. And so I think it's inevitable that your generation will not just be working on improving your own home country, but will have to be engaged in a global dialogue to secure a strong and growing global economy, a stable global economy. And we as an institution work on that. That's our job. And we can in the course of this conversation, I hope you'll pregúnteme un poco about the things we do, the things we don't do, or any other issues that you might have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lipton. We're going to go now to our panel about the economy. We're going from general to particular. We're going to talk about the world economy, then about Latin America, and then we're going to focus on Mexico. Let me start with Dr. Roubini. You are an economist with a lot of credibility. You predicted somehow the 2008-2009 economic crisis, global crisis. How do you see the world right now? The developed countries seems to have finally turned the corner, not the emerging markets. How do you see the world economy at this point?
Well, overall, I would say the global economy is recovering. If you look at advanced economies, probably this year growth is going to be around 2% average, much higher than the 1% that was in the last year. Certainly stronger than 2% in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, weaker than that in the Eurozone and Japan. So there is differentiation among different countries. And that recovery of advanced economies is driven by the fact that this year, with the exception of Japan, there is less fiscal drag. A lot of the fiscal adjustment in many countries has occurred. Secondly, this painful process of deleveraging, of reducing debts of households, corporates, banks, is now undergoing for a number of years. That's another positive. The third positive is driving the recovery of growth is that some of the tail risk in the global economy are lower probability today than they were a year ago. Tail risk of a breakup of the Eurozone, tail risk of a fiscal cliff in the US or another government shutdown or another fight on the debt ceiling, the tail risk of a real hard landing in China, or the tail risk of a war between Israel and Iran on the issue of nuclear proliferation. And the fourth reason why advanced economies are improving is while growth is going to accelerate, inflation remains low, below the 2% targets because there is enough still slack in goods market, excess capacity, output gaps, slack in the labor market with unemployment rate still high and wages are growing only moderately. And therefore, while growth is picking up with low inflation, central banks, whether it's the Fed or the Bank of England or the ECB or the Bank of Japan, can exit conventional and unconventional monetary easing only very slowly. Now, this is advanced economies. Emerging markets had a great decade of strong growth and of significant outperformance of their asset markets, but since last year, there's been a slowdown of growth and a correction in their currencies, bond markets, and equity. Some factors driving that slowdown are external to them. The Fed tapering, however gradually, that led to a rise in interest rates on the long end and money flowing out of emerging markets. Worries about the Chinese slowdown, maybe the end of the commodity super cycle. Those are external factors. But in the years where money was easy and zero policy rates were there and investors were searching for yield and investing into emerging markets, these inflows led to too much appreciation, excessive credit growth, loose monetary policy and inflation rising above target in some of these countries, a fiscal policy becoming looser with cheap financing. So macro condition became more fragile. And many of these emerging markets, and that's the final factor, lost a decade of potential structural reforms since things were easy on the macro side. If anything, some of them moved away from market-oriented reforms towards variants of state capitalism, too much role of the state-owned enterprise in the economy, of state-owned banks in the allocation of savings and investment, resource nationalism, trade protectionism. So those are the factors that have led to fragility. People refer to the fragile five, India, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, countries that have twin current account and fiscal deficits, falling growth, rising inflation, an election this year. Even within this group, there has been adjustment of policies, monetary, fiscal tightening to different degrees, and correction has occurred. And then there are other countries in emerging markets that people consider fragile for a host of different reasons: Ukraine, Russia, Hungary, Argentina, Venezuela, Thailand, and all of them, among other things, have some social and political unrest of one sort or the other. But we should recognize there are plenty of emerging markets that actually have much better fundamentals. There are the fragile ones, but in Asia, from Korea to Malaysia, Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, in Latin America, from Mexico to Peru, Colombia, Chile, while currently Brazil is more fragile. You know, some of the fastest growing economies in the world are frontier market in sub-Saharan Africa, in Eastern Europe, Poland, Czech Republic. So when you look at the emerging markets like advanced economies, probably you have to differentiate. There are some countries with stronger fundamentals, some of them with weaker. And even those that have weaker fundamentals right now, I think once election will pass, will be able to do more macro adjustment and more structural reform. After all, this country was one in which a new election with a new president, a new administration has led now to start passing reforms in the oil sector, in the electricity sector, tax reform, education reform, labor market reform, tax reform, financial reform, all things that, if implemented over time, will increase potential growth quite significantly. So sometimes political uncertainty and policy uncertainty is a chance for political change can be for the better.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lipton, for the whole world, the U.S. economy is important, but it's especially important for Mexico. I know that you have worked for the Obama administration. I know that the Obama administration, since day one, have been struggling with strengthening the U.S. economy. Is the U.S. economy strong enough now? I mean, it seems that it's cooling off the last few months. I mean, what is your diagnosis on the U.S. economy?
Well, first, let me say that President Obama faced a very severe financial crisis and in some sense perhaps had the toughest starting position as an economic matter of any president in recent memory. And a lot was done to try to get the economy going and to repair the problems in banks. But because these problems were about indebtedness of banks, indebtedness of households, they've had it's been a kind of a hangover, that the problems of households and banks have continued to exert a negative influence on the economy.
Still?
We think now that's beginning to lift. Okay. The U.S. economies, the U.S., you know, the way economists speak, balance sheets, the debts are being worked down to reasonable levels, and the fundamentals are improving, and there's a lot of pent-up demand. People didn't buy a lot of capital goods for a long time, and you've seen this country certainly notices when Americans start buying a lot of cars, and that's happened. Is it enough? No. We think the economy is strengthening. We are predicting that growth will be about 3% this year and next year. 3% this year. A little less than 3 this year, a little more next year.
Yeah.
But you are right that the recent data has been rather discouraging. For probably about 6 weeks, there have been announcements of results for particular developments in the U.S. economy that have been a bit of a surprise on the downside. So this happens from time to time. There's a bit of a conflict between what we believe about the fundamentals and what we're seeing in the data. They will not both turn out to be right. So either the fundamentals will strengthen and the data will get better, or will come to see that we didn't understand the fundamentals quite so well. But I think all our view is, and I think most economists' assessments are, that the U.S. economy is gathering speed, not enough to be the engine of growth that drives the global economy, not necessarily enough to get U.S. unemployment back to where it was before the crisis, but a quite favorable development, and one that will mean, and has already meant, more demand for other countries' exports.
It's interesting, this concept of growth engines. What would you say, Dr. Roubini, about right now? What are the growth engines in the world? Is it the United States? Is it China? Is it the European Union? I mean, how do you weight all these engines of growth in the global economy?
Well, I would start by saying that, first of all, we live in a world in which the role of emerging markets in global economic growth is rising. Yes, there is a slowdown of growth of emerging markets, but even this year, the average emerging market might be growing close to 5%. That's their potential growth, while potential growth in most advanced economies between 1 to 2, maybe 2.5% in the case of the United States. So even if every country in the world were to grow at its own potential, a larger share of global GDP and a larger share of global growth for years to come, if not decades to come, is going to come from emerging markets. Emerging markets, okay. In spite of their short difficulties, are already now 50% of global GDP and a larger share of global growth. So this is a longer-term trend beyond the fact that there's been a slowdown in emerging markets.
50%?
So about 50% of global GDP currently,
okay,
if you measure it on a purchasing power parity basis, comes from emerging markets, and that share is going to increase over time. So I would say longer-term trend is still one in which potential growth is higher in EM than advanced economies, and therefore their economic, trading, financial power is going to increase. And with greater economic, trading, financial power, there is also greater policy and political power. That's why, the G7 was the club of the advanced economies, became obsolete, and now the body that is the one that does international policy governance together with IMF and others is the G20, that is represented by 10 advanced economies and 10 of the largest and systemically more important emerging markets, including, of course, Mexico. Because to resolve many of the global economic problems are not anymore domestic. They're always spillovers of economic policies across the world. And therefore, whether we're thinking about currency issues or global current account imbalances, or whether we should do monetary easing or fiscal easing, or how we resolve issues of global climate change or trade liberalization, or resolving the reform of supervised regulation banks, or how we reform the international monetary system. All these problems are global, and therefore you need global governance. Therefore you need institutions like the IMF, like the World Bank, like the G20, that are the fora where all countries in the world can come together and discuss whether they can cooperate and coordinate on these global economic policies. So that's the longer-term trend. Now, in the short run, the U.S. growth is accelerating. The growth of advanced economies is becoming stronger, while the growth of emerging markets has slowed down. And within emerging markets, China, we grew 10% per year for the last 30 years, not going to be able to grow 10%. The debate is whether it's going to grow 7 or 7.5 or lower than 7. China has to rebalance its own economy and have a structural change from fixed investment to private consumption. And the debate on China is whether they're going to achieve that soft landing as opposed to something could be more risky. So those are some of the overall trends in terms of.
Let me go to Latin America, Dr. Lipton. How do you see the region of Latin America? There are many differences along the region. How do you see Latin America? That's it. Yeah.
There is no generalization that one can make. There's huge variety in the economies of the region, different approaches to economic policy, different kinds of linkages with each other and with the world. But in general, Latin America is growing. You might say it's in low gear. It would be better if Latin America were in a higher gear. That's been a goal for Latin American policymakers, including here in Mexico for some time. You know, to some extent, Latin American economies now face two challenges. I mean, the U.S. will be growing more rapidly, and that should be helpful. But emerging market countries growing more slowly is likely to mean downward pressure on commodity prices, and that's something that will be a challenge for some Latin American countries. But as here in Mexico, to get from the 2.75% average growth that Latin America has, roughly speaking, to something more like the rapidly growing emerging market countries in the world, in Asia, or even the frontier economies in Africa, to get from 2.75 to something much higher, like 4, 5, 6, requires new approaches, structural reforms, in some respects, getting government out of the way of business and labor, so that the ingenuity and the energy of workers, of businessmen, and can lead to higher productivity, higher incomes, better standard of living in time. You know, the IMF, we have an annual policy dialogue with all of our member countries. We try to give tailored advice that's appropriate to the individual country. We do that all over Latin America. So, you know, we have as you were sort of hinting, with every country different, we have a different kind of dialogue with each country. And there are countries that are, like Mexico, that are embracing change, and there are others that are less, at this juncture, less willing to do so.
Dr. Roubini, it seems to me that during this last decade, there were countries in Latin America that were focused on exporting commodities. And they were very successful because there was a high demand for commodities in the world. But now, with the slowing down of the Chinese economy, of the Asian economy, there is less demand for commodities. Now, what is, for countries like Brazil, like Argentina, like Venezuela, what is their challenge for transforming a commodity export economy to another kind of economy?
I think that you make a valid point. You know, the global environment for Latin America in the last few years, in some sense, was ideal. You had, zero policy rates and QE1, Q2, QE3, liquidity searching for yield going to emerging markets, including Latin America. You had the strong growth of China, and you had also this commodity boom that was in part China, but also in other sets of factors. And what the continent has to realize is that probably right now things are changing. China is going to slow down. The commodity super cycle probably is over, not only because China's slowing down and becoming less resource-oriented in its growth, but also with high prices. Now there are new producers of commodities that increase capacity. For example, Peru and Chile were among the major producers of copper, but after years of high prices, I was just this past year in Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Katanga, discoveries of copper mines there and investment have led to a significant increase of production that is now coming in the market and pushing down prices. So I think that one of the many challenges that the continent is facing is how to diversify away from a growth that was importantly based on commodities, but then increasingly, if there is going to be a correction of commodities, I don't think it's going to be a collapse of commodity prices, implies that you have to find different sources of economic growth. And paradoxically, in the good years where commodity prices were high, even in some of the countries in the region that had less market-oriented policies, the group of countries that had market-oriented policies, whether it was Mexico or Brazil or Chile or Colombia or Peru or Uruguay, but you had others that, broadly speaking, you would say, were more following populist policies to different degrees. Argentina, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, for example. But even those countries that were less market-oriented could grow at a reasonably robust rate because commodity prices, oil prices, other prices were high, and many of these countries were commodity exporters. Now the correction is occurring, and you see growth slowing down in Argentina or in Venezuela, and we lose fiscal and monetary policy, inflation becoming high and under control. So some countries actually have to stabilize their own macroeconomic policy. I think one of the lessons of the last 20, 30 years, one thing that the IMF has emphasized is that if you don't have macroeconomic stability, then eventually you'll have economic disaster. You know, this loose monetary and fiscal policy, monetizing fiscal deficit eventually leads to high inflation, if not hyperinflation, with boom, bubbles, bust and crashes, that then also leads to political cycles of moving from populist regimes to authoritarian, back to populist. One of the good things that's happened, I think, in Latin America is that there's been a move to the center. Yeah, there are some slightly more radical regimes that most countries, whether it's governments are more center-right or center-left, have realized economic liberalization, structural reform, macroeconomic stability that has led to less of these volatile boom and bust that are hugely damaging of economic activity, negative affect social and political stability. Now, how you diversify away from commodities, I think there are good news. Per capita income has been rising. Many of these countries are becoming consumer societies. There is a rise of the middle class. I think that in every country in the world, you can be blessed with natural resources, but your greatest resource is what economists refer as human capital, young people, that if they get the right training, education, and so on, that's the basis of long-term productivity growth. You know, there are some countries in the world that have zero natural resources that import all of them. Places like Japan or Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Israel. These were countries that 50, 60 years ago were much poorer than even some of those in Latin America. How did they grow so fast? They invested into really human capital and giving the right education and skills to their people. And luckily, Latin America has natural resources. So you have, in addition to human capital, also natural resource capital. But then you have to invest into your human capital, into your physical capital, into your financial capital, into your infrastructure capital, and so on. And if all of those things are going to happen, there will be a process of economic diversification. It's going to lead to domestic sources of growth, not just external ones, and a more diversified economy that exploits natural resource orientation for diversification. Take Canada, take Australia, take Norway. These are countries that have a lot of natural resources, but then they were able to build ancillary industries around them. You can go into refinery, into petrochemical, into provision of services for natural resources, and then grow financial services and a variety of other manufacturing and economic services. So that process of diversification is important, makes also the growth more inclusive, reduces the inequality because some of the resource orientation can be too capital intensive. It's a process that takes time.
Dr. Lipton, we are somehow seeing some countries in Latin America returning to the 80s. They're returning to high inflation, Argentina, Venezuela. Are they going to need adjustment plans for stopping inflation? It seems that, you know, I mean, somehow they need to stop inflation in those countries. I mean, what's the vision of the IMF in that regard? Before we can go to Mexico, because I want to talk about Mexico, but these high inflation countries, how do you see?
Well, the two countries that you mentioned each have their own problems. I think they're rather different, although you're right that inflation is a feature of the problem. And in both cases, essentially using money printing to finance government spending and not having a central bank regime that keeps inflation low has proven to be a problem. And they'll each have to find a way through that. Those happen to be two countries that have long and rather troubled relationships with the IMF, and so our dialogue with them is not what we would like it to be, although we do try in whatever ways we can to offer them advice. I think their circumstances are rather different. I think in each case there is a way to overcome the problem, but they will have to find a way to In the case of Venezuela, during the period of President Chavez, quite substantial transfers were made in order to provide services, health and education services to poor people. And for many years, those were within bounds that the government could manage, but I think they've gotten out of bounds, and so they need to get back in bounds. Argentina's issues are somewhat more complex, and I won't venture a view, but I think in both cases, if the leadership there wished to bring things under control, there would be a way to do it.
Let me go to Mexico. 1 year ago, we were talking about the Mexican moment, the Aztec tiger. It was this huge optimism, and we grew 1.1% last year. And this year, it doesn't seem that we're going to grow a lot. I mean, how do you see Mexico? Is it really a Mexican moment? I mean, what's the outside view or the view of the IMF on Mexico?
The tiger may have run slowly for a while, but we're expecting a much faster pace in the coming year. Look, I think that there are reasons why the Mexican economy slowed some, and there are a bunch of different reasons. I think they're fundamentally transitory reasons. Having to do with developments in the United States, developments in the global economy, and the very rapid pace with which reform is being implemented here. But I think when you look forward with the United States economy strengthening and with the reforms under the belt here basically done, and with a budgetary posture here that is imparting some stimulus to the economy, we expect the economy to recover. But to me, gauging whether Mexico is an Aztec tiger based on any 1 year or 2 years isn't really fair, because it isn't a question of whether the tiger runs for a little bit. The question is whether you all can get this economy going at a faster pace, a significantly faster pace. And that's where I think the reforms that have been undertaken, while everybody has their own views about the wisdom of each feature of each reform, and I've heard a range of views on that here in my very short visit, it clearly paves the way for improvements in economic performance in the future. A lot will depend on how the government follows up on these reforms. Will the energy sector really become open to risk sharing and competition from the private sector? Will the telecommunications sector really be reformed, that the new institute that is supposed to govern that, will it really create competitive conditions so that you'll have better access to telephone services, internet, television, et cetera, et cetera? What will the education reforms and the labor reforms mean in practice? We can go down the line and talk about each one, but this has been, I think, quite a significant reform, and if it's followed up to fulfill the potential of the reform, it could be very good for everyday Mexicans, meaning more job opportunities, more productive jobs, and as a result, better living standards.
I don't know why foreigners are more optimistic than Mexicans. We are more skeptical about what's going on in the country. I know that we cannot...
I didn't say it would be easy.
I know that we cannot focus our attention on what happened last year. We have to foresee the long term. But, I mean, it seems to me, it strikes me, Dr. Roubini, that really there are many foreigners that are very optimistic about Mexico. Are you optimistic about Mexico?
First of all, I am, and it's true that there is a bit of a perception.
And he's never optimistic.
I'm always realistic, and I see upside as opposed to downside risks. Yeah, there is a little bit of a gap right now between maybe the perception of foreigners. We're seeing, energy reform, electricity reform, tax reform, financial reform, education reform, labor reform, competition reform, telecom, antitrust, even good work on security issues and progress on that. And all these things actually, I do believe, if they're implemented, are going to increase potential growth and make the economy stronger. I think that maybe some of the internal skepticism comes from just cautiousness. You know, some constitutional changes occurred. Now you have to do a bunch of enabling legislation. Yep. Then after you have done that, you have to implement it. Of course, there are also lobby groups that are going to resist things. Like, you know, as in other countries, there is not enough competition in telecoms and other restricted sector of the economy. So the cost of many goods, the cost of many services is high. And actually, from a social point of view, I would say one of the most regressive things that can happen in a country is when you have oligopolies that charge very high prices for a lot of services. So for any given level of wages, the higher our prices, the lower is your purchasing power. So I think that trying to increase that competition and reducing the cost of a variety of goods and services is one thing that is very socially progressive, that can improve, for example, income and wealth inequality. So I would say there will be interest groups that are going to resist it, whether they are teachers' unions or unions within PEMEX or big corporates who have been benefiting from rent-seeking from their own monopolies and oligopolies. And then, as we know, the devil is in the details. I mean, take even the energy reform, you know, is not truly, how to say, giving up your natural resources, but then letting the private sector participate. They're not concessions, they're licenses. Is it the same thing just with a different word, or is it something different? How will it be the tail of production sharing or profit sharing things be implemented in a way that gives a great incentive to foreign firms and domestic private firms to enter in these markets and so on. So I think there's a lot of detail that has to be implemented. I'm positive that all these things are going to happen because it looks like in Mexico there's been a national consensus across the political spectrum, with the exception of some maybe very radical groups, that these reforms were needed, center-right, center-left, current government opposition. So there was this consensus, and now hard work of doing it is going to occur. But as this thing is going to occur, then I think the benefits over time are going to occur. You're going to see more capital spending. The consumer is a bit in a funk because real wages have not been growing. You're going to see more job creation, more wage creation, and therefore consumption growth is going to also accelerate. So I think it's only a question of time until we'll see the positive benefits out of all these reforms. And some of them create more uncertainty. Say the tax reform, I think, is necessary because the tax burden was very low in Mexico, and provision of a variety of public services, public investment requires financing. But of course, those who are going to have to pay for it are going to be resisting it and feeling that it's a levy on their own economic activity. So even stuff that is positive, take times, and some of the reforms have been only incremental. Probably more could have been done to liberalize the labor market and reducing firing costs. That reform has been, okay, going in the right direction first in 50 years, but not going as far as reducing the sources of this economic dualism that is in the economy, where since the cost of firing people is so high, then people prefer to be informal or not to hire people in the formal sector and so on. So more needs to be done.
Let me ask you, Dr. Lipton, about our demographic bonus that we have in Mexico. We are with a young audience, and it's very important to have that bonus. Some countries, they don't have it, like China. They have demographic problems. I mean, why is that important, this demographic bonus, and why do we have to take advantage of that bonus?
Well, I mean, I think the first aspect of the bonus is that you'll have a higher number of working age people here in Mexico to help cover, in a sense, the whatever the financial costs are of helping along with pensions and health and other in other ways the retired population. And in the reverse situation, a situation many countries face, that can be quite onerous. and can lead to the need for rather higher tax rates on the working age population.
Like Europe.
The other aspect of it is that your labor force can continue to grow. I mean, you have many young people entering the labor force. You also have a huge informal sector, so there's a lot of room for making more productive uses and having more productive organization of the entities that are hiring young people. But I think it also means that in this day and age where the world is changing so fast, education, what it means is changing, what kinds of education you need is changing, having the tools to navigate the modern world, to be able to use the internet, learn about new technologies, learn about science, math, and so on, and put those to work, you'll just have, I think you have the opportunity here for a vibrant, dynamic workforce. Whereas if people are mostly in the 45 to 50 bracket, learning again and keeping up is, in this day and age, is a much harder thing. Now, will it be a bonus? Well, it really does depend on whether the young people of Mexico are, whether they have access to education, and whether they have jobs. And that links back to the discussion we just had about the need to have an economic structure that will generate work opportunities and productive working opportunities for people.
I have two more questions, and then we're going to go to the audience. And I have to remind you that we have the hashtag Pregunta al FMI. If you, we have received some questions. We're going to go to those questions after these two questions. One of the questions is, and we share that with Latin America and with other emerging countries, we have two huge problems, which is inequality and the other one, poverty. I mean, I know that you can talk like, I don't know, a whole seminar about those two issues, but what is your main message for resolving those problems, inequality and poverty?
Well, I would say, first of all, if a country grows very fast, that by itself implies that for any given level of inequality, of course, people who are poor become eventually middle class, and people who are middle class become of higher income. So trying to follow policy that increase potential growth is always beneficial.
But just economic growth, it's a first step for...
I would say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition, because when growth is low, there is no job creation, there is social and political instability that lead then to even less investment, and then leads to less job creation, and that persists inequality. Of course, a lot of talk has been around the world, including this region, about the fact that growth has to be, inclusive. Inclusive means that giving opportunity to people to be able to, at least having jobs and income rising, try to reduce over time with the appropriate policies, income and wealth inequality. How you do it is complicated. I would say that while the private sector has to be the main driver of economic growth, there is an important role that government can play. First of all, you can have a social safety net for the poor. I mean, places like Brazil, by offering, minimum level of subsidy and transfer to households, have been reduced absolute poverty. Secondly, having some basic public services provided with good quality and with cheap prices, whether it's public transportation, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare. Of course, having investment in the right types of infrastructure that increase the productivity of the private sector and therefore the productivity of labor also over time is a source of reducing inequality. As I pointed out, competition policy is critical. The more you have competition, the less there are oligopolies or monopolies can charge a lot of high prices for the goods and services that they provide. So I think that enlightened economic policies by the government that foster economic growth, that provide opportunities so that everybody, regardless of their own economic, social, ethnic background can have access, for example, to good healthcare and education, and if they're smart and work hard, they're going to do better, are very important. So those are some of the factors, of course, that over time can make growth more cohesive, reduce poverty, and reduce inequality at the same time.
Would you like to jump on that? On this?
I think Nouriel's points, I share Nouriel's view. I would just say that, you know, the greatest poverty reduction episode in my lifetime, and it started probably just before all of yours, is what happened when China decided to join the global economy. Literally hundreds of millions of people have been lifted from abject poverty and now are part of a labor force, part of a formal economy. They are, you know, they don't have levels of income like here in Mexico, but they are not poor in the way that they were. And that illustrates Nouriel's point. It can happen. A period of rapid growth can lift a lot of people out of poverty. There is then the question of, if you have inequality, is it something that is just a, let's say, a moral and social issue, or is it an economic issue? And there's been a tradition, a literature, say, in economics that suggests that when you try to correct inequality, you pay a price in terms of growth. It's a theory that's been called the leaky bucket theory, that if you take resources from this guy over here and carry it to this guy over here, the bucket leaks and you end up with less by the time you're done. You know, one thing that we do at the IMF is a lot of research, and we've been doing research on this topic because it's, I think, very important in today's economy, in the global economy. And we're finding, we've got, I think, some new data and some new experiences around the world that we've looked at, and we're calling this result into question. It appears to us that actually our researchers are showing that inequality hurts growth, which would suggest that if you can devise ways to lessen inequality, perhaps you can actually have a better growth situation. Now, exactly how you redistribute, if you choose to redistribute, is a complex matter. It clearly can be done in ways that are, in a sense, positive sum for everybody. If you use tax revenues to provide health and education for poorer people, it's probably something that's going to help all of society eventually. And there are better and worse ways. And we've also done a work that we'll be publishing in the middle of March that provides guidance for countries that wish to pursue redistributive policies on, in a sense, the do's and don'ts. Are there better and worse ways to try to address inequality?
Well, last question. The next step for NAFTA, you know that we are celebrating 20 years of this trade agreement. I mean, what is the next step, Dr. Lipton? You work for the government, you were involved with Clinton administration, with Obama administration. What is next in this regard?
Well, and that's up to Mexico, Canada, and the United States. I think that to me, NAFTA clearly has been a success in the sense that it has generated a huge amount of trade and I think of jobs. It hasn't necessarily been associated with the kind of growth that Mexico may have wanted, but I think Mexico has benefited. I think there are ways to deepen NAFTA by deepening the integration between the Mexican and the U.S. economies, by aligning regulation so that safety standards and other regulatory standards are the same in both places. So you don't have to have one kind of car with a standard that's up to the U.S. and another kind of car that's up to a standard for Mexico, or whether it's a fancy good like a car or a toy. Right now you have to make a toy with one safety standard, toy with another. Same is true across a wide range of goods. So I think there's some deepening. There's probably ways to provide for easier flow of people, goods, etc. I think the next step, though, is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Again, it's something that could lead to very good outcomes or not so good outcomes depending on what the negotiators negotiate. But it is a region where integration could be expanded to a much wider circle of countries and number of people. And that's, I think, the most promising new initiative that's out there.
Would you like to say something about NAFTA, Dr. Roubini?
I mean, I agree with the points that David made. I would say there are some bilateral issues between US and Mexico having to do with migrations, with restrictions to the flow of goods, services, and people on the border. I think some of the infrastructures at the border on both sides can increase. You could have trusted traveler program that allow people that are pre-checked to be able to move more easily than is right now. So those things have to be addressed. I think that with both Canada, US, and Mexico having now an energy revolution, you know, shale gas and oil sands, all the offshore and onshore stuff is going to happen. If you can have an integrated North American market for energy, energy prices can fall significantly. That's going to be beneficial not only to capital-intensive manufacturing, but also to manufacturing generally. You know, Mexico already right now has green labor costs that are probably comparable to China, as wages have been growing very rapidly in China. Transportation costs are lower. If you could reduce your energy costs, that's going to really make your manufacturing even more competitive. After all, 80% of your exports are still going to the United States. So I think there is room for greater regional North American integration, but then there's the prospect of the Trans-Pacific is going to be a much bigger thing that will be beneficial to all.
Thank you very much. Well, we are going to take some of the questions that you send by Twitter with the hashtag Pregúntale al FMI. I have some of the questions that we have received. Let me start. There are 2 or 3 questions about the effects of the tapering in the US, the reversal of capitals from emerging markets now to developed markets. I mean, how does the IMF see this situation of the tapering and the challenge for emerging economies such as Mexico?
Always amazes me that no matter where I go, there are Fed watchers.
Yes, of course.
The most important aspect of what the Fed is doing is that it's going to be removing some of the very stimulative policy that it's been using to fight crisis as the country's recovering. Our view is that as long as the pace of removing this stimulus goes along with the recovery, everything will basically be okay. And by that I mean, of course, that if the U.S. economy is recovering, that's going to mean more U.S. demand for foreign goods, and countries like Mexico that have fairly deep trade integration will gain. And the normalization of interest rates, first the less interventions of asset purchases and eventually interest rate increases, will be a natural transition. That process of normalization will be natural, and it won't raise interest rates any more than is appropriate given the strength of U.S. recovery. Now, if somehow either there's a country that only feels the effect of higher interest rates but doesn't get any of the benefits of U.S. demand, and there are some such countries. A country like South Africa, for example, has financial links, so its bond interest rates move with U.S. bond interest rates. And they don't buy much from the United States, or they don't sell much to the United States, so they don't get the benefits. There could be some countries that have a more negative outcome. But we think that on balance for the world as a whole, the normalization could be helpful. The other instance where it could be problematic, of course, is if somehow the interest rates go up much higher than is called for or than is appropriate in light of the improvements in the U.S. economy. And since markets push around interest rates, it's possible that that will happen. And we'll have to watch that. I think the Fed will be watching that and will be trying to avoid it. So to us, this is, while this is an unprecedented process because the Fed's never done unconventional policy of this kind on this scale, and so we don't know that it will all work out, we think that the approach that the Fed is taking seems to be both cautious and sensible.
However, we have seen in Turkey, they devalued their currency and they increased, I don't know, by 3 times their interest rates overnight. I mean, there are sharp and important consequences of this tapering policy.
Yeah, but the consequences, I think, as David points out, depend on the country. There are some emerging market economies that have relatively large current account deficits and fiscal deficits, so they rely on foreign financing, or foreigners buying their bonds, and those are more subject to the pressure that come from long-term interest rates going higher in the US because of the announcement of tapering, eventually even short rates rising in the US. And those countries were also behind the curve because growth was slowing down and monetary policy was too loose and inflation was rising. So when the taper tantrum started, it hit them big time. And some of these countries also are less geared to the growth recovery of US, Europe, and Japan because their trade links with US, Europe, and Japan are smaller. But then there are countries like Mexico or Korea or tons of other examples that have either smaller twin deficits or in some cases current account surpluses and fiscal sound balances, so they don't need significant foreign financing. They do a lot of more trade with the United States or with advanced economies, so they're geared to recover stronger as there is a recovery of advanced economies. And on net, actually, for them, the tapering is going to be less of an issue, and the acceleration of growth, say, of the U.S. is going to be benefiting them through the export channel. So I think there is a diversification, of course, a Turkey or a South Africa or a Brazil or even India and Indonesia were more vulnerable to the effects of the tapering, but even them have taken. No, not Mexico, because Mexico is geared to the strengthening of U.S. growth.
Okay.
The current account deficit, 1% of GDP. I mean, the other country was speaking about 3, 4, 5, even more. So 1 is still modest, and the fiscal situation also sound in terms of modest deficits, stock of public debt being low. So Mexico, actually, I would put it among the safer countries from this perspective.
Well, there were a couple of questions about the Ukraine. I mean, are you concerned about the Ukraine situation, Dr. Lipton?
I've spent most of the last week on things having to do with Ukraine. And it's a country that I've worked in and followed for about 20 years, really since their independence from the Soviet Union. There are 2 aspects of the difficulties in Ukraine. One, obviously, is the economic dimension that, as President Yanukovych left, Ukraine had been developing financial vulnerabilities and edging towards crisis for a year. And we, the IMF, had a dialogue with them for some time. I'd gone to Ukraine and met with President Yanukovych and with his economic team to try to encourage them to address the problems that they have. And they, for various reasons, chose not to take the policy steps that were needed to reduce these vulnerabilities. And then in the period of this uprising there, clearly the economic situation has gotten more complicated. They have seen disruptions to their financial markets, their banks, their revenue system of the budget, and so on and so forth. So they have an economic problem to fix. And then, of course, as well, they have security issues revolving around all of what's going on in Crimea. Now there's a new government, a new interim president and a new government. They've invited us, last week they invited us to come visit. We have a team that arrived there today. We'll spend a week trying to understand with them, try to understand what their situation is and what it will take to restore stability and eventually growth in Ukraine. And if it comes to it, if they're willing to take some of the steps to address their problems, we'll be ready to provide financial support and to try to go around and encourage others, the U.S. government, the European governments, the other international financial institutions, the World Bank, etc., to try to put together a package of finance that will help Ukraine stay stable. And that's what we hope that that's the road Ukraine will want to go down.
Dr. Roubini, we have also some questions, a couple of questions about Mohamed Yunus' business model. You know, this credit for, cheap credits for small businesses. What do you think about that, and is that kind of a solution for economic growth in emerging markets?
Well, there are lots of experiences with, you know, all these microcredit, starting with what he did a long time ago. But I would say that in addition to microcredit, one of the important constraints to economic growth is availability of financial services for people who are poor, whether it's availability of credit for economic activity, you know, small businesses that need to have access to bank lending and have only limited access, you know, availability of financing sometimes for education, being able to make payment system, payments, transfer even of money from abroad, from relatives and so on, cheaply and so on. So some of it might be the microcredit revolution, but you know, I spent a significant amount of time in the last year, say in Sub-Saharan Africa, where now mobile payment systems allow even to very poor who don't have access to a bank deposit to do a wide variety of financial transactions and businesses. So I think that the issue of financial deepening is important. You know, there are many sources of factors behind the fact that growth in Mexico has been moderate, but one of them is probably that there is not as much financial intermediation, especially for the poor. And since Mexico went through a variety initially of financial crises in '82 and then in '94 and so on, and then there was a decade of not much financial development, in some cases not enough competition and provision of some services. I think that one of the things that probably is going to be important for the country is to have that deepening of provision of financial services to the economy in general, to small businesses, and to the poor in particular. And I would say also, in many cases, you know, economic opportunity for women in many parts of the world, whether it's microcredit or otherwise. There are women who want to be entrepreneurial, start a small business, and don't have access to credit. And it's still in Latin America, the labor force participation rate of many women is still too low compared to what should be. And one of the sources actually of stronger economic growth, of reduction of poverty, of inequality, is to raise the educational opportunity, the job opportunity, the business opportunity for women. And the financial sector is one of the factors can help for that one. So,
okay. We are receiving a lot of questions, and that's fortunately we are receiving those. So let me go quickly with some of these questions. What do you think about increasing the government deficit in order to increase the public spending? That is happening in Mexico, by the way. We are increasing the public deficit, and in order to increase the public spending.
Well, I'm going to give you an economist answer. It depends. There are times when increasing the public deficit can cause financial problems. That's happened here in this country. If the deficit gets out of control, if government debt rises too much, it can cause problems. There are other times when, if the management of public finances has been sound and is perceived as sound, and the economy is sluggish, an increase in public spending can be part of the way that a government addresses the sluggishness of the economy. If it's going to be done, our advice typically is to have a fiscal anchor, to have a clear plan of how you're going to get the budget back under control, and to be able to demonstrate that you will do that, and that as you do that, the government debt will remain at reasonable and serviceable levels. For example, here, as I understand it, the government has a projected path for budget adjustment that would bring the deficit down to 2.5% over the next 3 years. That seems to us to be a sensible approach. We would like to see stronger and clearer long-term anchors as time goes on. But, you know, so the answer is that it really does depend on circumstances, and you can't give us let's say, an answer for all seasons.
Okay, last question for Dr. Roubini from the Twitter, and then we're going directly to you guys, to the audience. We're going to have direct questions. So let me ask you, what do you think, what kind of regulations we can establish or we can set up in order to prevent another economic bubble?
Well, I think that the lessons of the global financial crisis is that excessive debt and leverage and risk-taking and excessive credit growth going to financial leverage eventually can lead to asset frothiness, then a boom, then a bubble, and eventually the boom and the bubble goes into a bust and a crash. So I think that the well-functioning financial system is one in which there is a proper supervision and regulation of the financial system. Not too much regulation, not too little, where banks have enough buffer of capital, so that if losses occur, they don't go under. They have enough buffer of liquidity. And some of the reforms that have been done globally after the global financial crisis are going into that direction. So I think that history suggests that, you know, of course, some debt makes sense both in the private and public sector, but when there is too much increase in debt that is fueling especially financial bubbles, eventually the bust can be very damaging because the asset price collapse occurs, then you're left with the debts you cannot service, and then a process of painful defaults and other things happens as well. And therefore, a prudential regulation supervision of the financial system is probably one of the key elements that make sure that some of the excesses don't occur, you know, in the first place. You know.
What about rating agencies? Because they failed completely in the last financial crisis.
Yeah, I mean, rating agencies failed, but everybody else also, you know, failed. I mean, whenever there is a bubble, in some sense, households in the U.S. were doing well because home prices were going up and people were essentially borrowing money out of their homes to spend more than they could. Households were happy. The politicians were happy because the economy was growing. The regulators were asleep at the wheel, believing that then laissez-faire would work. The banks were doing lots of money. The rating agencies were doing lots of money. The brokers and agents were making lots of money. Everybody in the financial system and the real economy lived in a bubble, and things that, of course, were not sustainable, like believing that home prices can go up 15–20% per year became conventional wisdom. So the issue is whenever there is a bubble, you know, the blame has to be shared quite widely. So rating agencies are, of course, one of them, but I would say lots of other people who made lots of other mistakes. So the question how you can avoid the doing in these boom and bubbles and the bust and the crash that follows them. So you need the overall sound economic policy, starting with proper monetary and fiscal and proper regulation supervision of the financial system.
Quite a fiesta was that, no? As we say in Mexico. Good fiesta. Okay.
Can I say one thing? As we go to the audience, I'd like to ask Leo, if it's all right with you, if people want to ask a question or if you want to make a comment, I'd like to hear those. Often in Washington, to discourage comments, people will say at the beginning of a session like this, your question should be short and end with a question mark. But I'd rather say it quite the opposite. If some of you have a comment to make, I'd like to hear it. Okay?
Good. Thank you. So let's go. Do we have microphones in the audience? Yes. There is one question over there.
Yes, it's a question for Mr. Lipton.
Si te paras, si te levantas y nos dices tu nombre y qué haces.
Well, my name is Manuel Durazo. I study political science here at ITAM, but I like a lot of economic issues. and well, I like it a lot. So I have a question for Mr. Lipton, and it's about the role of the state in the economy and the public spending in development and innovation. So I heard you said that state needs to step aside of some certain markets like labor or others, but I also heard that you said that Mexico needs to diversify its economy. So my question is, and my comments, how do you diversify Mexican economy without state intervention? Because private sector is not taking enough risk. Venture capital is not taking risks. They do not take the risk to innovate. We only export cheap, but we do not innovate. State is not investing in capabilities. So my question is, why won't the state do that? Why do we left it to the private sector since the 90s? Because in the case of US, it's clear to me that the state really intervened to generate those innovations, like the Department of Energy or the Department of Defense who invented the internet. So in Mexico, we do not do that. Now, let me tell you some facts about just a little facts about our partners on NAFTA. Public spending in Mexico in innovation and development is 5.7 points lower than in the US and 4.3 lower than in Canada. Why won't we invest in capabilities rather than on cheap exports? Thank you.
That's a hard question. Look, I think you're right that many advances in both in the United States and Europe have come with government involvement. And there's really quite a lot of study of that, and it's clear that you can do it well or you can do it badly. Monies have been spent well in supporting research and development. Sometimes, as you point out, there are byproducts that come from defense spending, which has, of course, in and of itself, an entirely different purpose. There are also instances of governments that spend a lot of, or misspend a lot of money, or chase down particular approaches and ideas. This is not an area where I have any particular expertise, so I'm sorry I can't give you a set answer, except to say I think it is right that Mexico needs to focus on both. The private sector clearly can become a more dynamic, risk-taking and innovative place. I think some of the reforms, I mean, including in the two key sectors we've talked about, energy and telecom, some of the reforms, I think, have the potential to do that. But whether the government needs, through its own programs, to have some greater focus on supporting innovation and technological development, I'd say that's a good subject. I suppose there's people here in Mexico who know a lot more about what's been tried than I do, so I won't venture to say any more than that.
There is a question. A ver, de este lado no hay. Okay, two in the front here. Tú tienes una, ¿verdad? A ver, y luego se las pasamos a ustedes. Okay. ¿Te puedes parar, por favor? Te presentas, por favor.
De la Garza, I study economics and finance here. And my question is, what are the possible resolutions to the global disequilibrium that Dr. Roubini has described? Where does Mexico today fit into that global disequilibrium? And where could it be given the panorama of the public agenda that we've seen throughout the past?
I think that Mexico in many ways is quite well positioned because first of all, no country is an island, and whatever happens in the rest of the world matters for every country, including a small open economy like Mexico. For a while, China was a massive growth engine of manufacturing. But I think what's happened right now in China is that the labor costs have been rising. Being actually closer to your customer is important. Transportation costs are still a meaningful issue. So the fact that Mexico, first of all, is close to the United States, that is still the largest economy in the world, among advanced economies is the fastest growing, still dynamic, entrepreneurial, with all the issues the US has, is a benefit for Mexico. The fact there is NAFTA, there is greater trade integration, the fact that North America has found massive new sources of energy, and with the reform Mexico is going to do, production is going to increase, that energy costs are going to fall sharply, so North America is going to become actually a low-cost producer in a wide range of goods and services. The fact that even Chinese that were not doing a lot of foreign direct investment might invest now in Mexico as a base for operations, for exporting goods to the United States. There is a lot of stuff. I think the lesson of the last 56 years are small open economies that integrate in the global economy tend to do much better because your domestic market is limited, while if you open up to the world, you have a market of billions. And by the way, Mexico is not a small country, it's a country of 100 million plus people. So there is a huge domestic market, but there's also a country that's opened up to trade, to foreign direct investment, to the global economy, and has significantly benefited from that. And more of that thing is going to happen. Then exactly what are the sectors in which Mexico has a comparative advantage? Some of them are traditional, some of them are going to change over time, but I would say a country like this one can benefit the most from being integrated in the global economy, integrated with closed trade with US, Canada, integrated with the Trans-Pacific stuff, and being able to be a dynamo of both domestic and foreign demand for its own economic growth and job opportunities.
Let me tell you that questions in Spanish are also welcome. I'm going to say this in Spanish. No se me vayan a chicopalar los que no saben inglés, así que si tienen alguna pregunta, háganla en español y aquí se las traducimos. No se preocupen, no les vamos a cobrar nada. Okay, here.
My name is Gerardo Reyes Varela. I study economics here in ITAM. And my question is to Mr. Roubini. Do you think capital injection in 2008 was the best solution to the crisis? And has it had any effects on, other economies, especially like in Europe or in Mexico? Thank you.
Capital injection means to the banking system or where?
I guess from the public sector, no? I mean, the transferring from public sector money to...
Secretary Paulson's decision in...
I think that actually, that decision in part might have been controversial because people said the trouble was caused by too much risk-taking by bankers and traders, why we end up bailing them out. But I think, Ben Bernanke and fellow policymakers learned the lessons of the Great Depression that started just as a stock market crash, and they realized if you had a total collapse of the banking system, then the credit crunch will become even more severe, and therefore the economic damage could have been worse. This Great Recession could have become Great Depression 2.0. Therefore, doing injections first of liquidity and then of capital in the banks was necessary. And one actually of the reasons why, if you compare the United States with the Eurozone, the recovery in the US has been stronger and the Eurozone has been weaker. Part of it was that the US has done much more aggressive monetary and fiscal stimulus. The Fed compared to the ECB on monetary policy, the US did its fiscal stimulus and took it away more slowly than the Eurozone, where there was a front load of the fiscal austerity. But the other part of it was that European banks were as leveraged as the US ones, maybe even more so. But right now, 5 years later, we still don't know what are the losses in the European banks. They'll do an asset quality review, a stress test, and after that, injection of either private or public capital is going to occur that eventually is going to reduce that credit crunch. While the US told all banks, take this money, whether you need it or not. If you don't need it a year from now, you can show me your profits. Of course, you can pay me back. The recapitalization occurred faster, the credit crunch was smaller, and the recovery of the US has been more robust than Europe. So that was something was controversial, but actually is one of the factors that explain, the better performance. Of course, you want to avoid moral hazard, and that implies that now liquidity capital charger for banks and more regulation to make sure they don't take too much leverage staking has to be tighter so that there is no expectation of you're too big to fail and then I'm going to do the same thing the next time around. But I think that policy response was necessary and was desirable, even if at the time was somehow controversial.
There is a question here, please. How are we doing with the time? We are okay? Yes? So 5 more minutes? So we can have maybe 2 or 3 more questions? Is that okay? Yes? Okay, venga.
Oh, my name is Alejandro Rivera. I study actuarial science and finances here. And my question is related to the organized crime. As we know, organized crime has a huge impact in Mexican and global economy. And I want to know, what do you think about legalizing certain drugs as marijuana as a measure to incorporate economic impact derived from organized crime into formal economy? And what are the ethical and moral implications in that decision?
You didn't...
I don't know, whoever wants to answer.
Es el cambio de la economía informal, si entendí bien, a la economía formal.
O sea, al legalizar las drogas para incorporar ese impacto económico a la economía formal, ¿cuáles son las implicaciones?
Pero nada más del tema de las drogas. ¿Sí? He's asking about drug policy and this decision of legalizing drugs.
Y también relacionado a lo que acaban de hacer en Estados Unidos en ciertos estados como Washington o Colorado.
There is this legalization for recreational purposes of marijuana in Colorado and Washington. How would that affect the economy, no? And the whole drug policy? I guess that's an easy question.
A lot of people are asking whether it's going to lower productivity. If everybody's not as focused as they ought to be, let's put it that way. You know, this is a long time coming in the United States. It represents, I think, a change of view. It's not, as you know, it's not universal in the United States, but rather it's, since it's a matter of states, legal authorities, it's happening in some places rather than others. I think it's early days to say what impact it will have either on the drug business in the United States or the health consequences in the United States, let alone interactions with countries that have been suppliers. So I don't have a hard, fast analysis of it. I think it's just it's too soon to say. In our country, it remains a controversial matter, and there are people with strong views on both sides. I don't know, Nouriel, if you have.
I don't know if you want. I know that there is a supply problem in Colorado, and they cannot meet the demand of marijuana, of legal marijuana.
I mean, it's, let's put it this way, you know, of course, on this side of the border, I think correctly people say it's not just an issue of supply. You have to deal with the demand, and maybe those are legal rights of individual states. Decriminalizing things like marijuana might be the right thing to do. You don't want to decriminalize even heavier drugs that are really damaging effects of one sort or another. So I think that you have to work on both sides of this question. You know, in the case of Mexico, I think that there's been a concern about security. Some people say it's a minor problem, very localized in some specific places. Some people say, no, it's something that generates uncertainty, is bad for business investment across the board. Probably reality is somewhere in between. But gradually and stepwise, in collaborating also with the United States, addressing the demand side, addressing the supply, reducing the criminality, cracking down on it, is something that's going to lead to a lot of economic stability as well. So I think that this is not an issue. This is black and white. You have to work on both sides of it.
Okay, we have a question here. Y terminamos allá atrás. A ver, pero quiero que también participen las mujeres, así que no, porque si no luego me dicen que me tachan de misógino y no lo soy para nada. Vas tú, luego vas tú y terminamos contigo, and that's it. Los tengo que entrevistar yo para la tele a los señores y bueno, nos tenemos que ir. Pero bueno, va.
My name is Andrea Neira, and I study here economics. And my question intends to be with energy reforms, now referred in Mexico, that are very popular. How does energy reforms like Mexican affect an economy based on oil? Like we have the second cheapest gasoline here. So is that going to change the price on oil, or is that going to affect us like directly?
Or what are the consequences of energy reform, no? On domestic prices?
Yeah, on domestic prices.
Domestic gas and gasoline?
Yeah, that's right.
But gasoline is not so cheap in Mexico.
I think it's the cheapest after Venezuela. And
Venezuela, it's practically free, but Mexico is somehow approaching to the U.S., the price of Mexico. Actually, well, anyway, they are the panelists.
Retail pricing for gasoline is, in a sense, a separate decision because the government can put on an excise tax that raises the price or not. But I think the important parts of the energy reform are to bring more risk-taking capital into the exploration and production so that some of the more technically difficult fields, in particular the offshore fields, can be exploited and exploited efficiently, with the idea that that will provide both a fuel for Mexico and also export capabilities that will lead to earnings for the country that can be used for other things. And then secondly, the second aspect of it is to open up, in a sense, the electricity generation sector, which could bring cost reductions if electricity generation is more competitive and cheaper. It could bring cost reductions that are beneficial across the economy because, in essence, electricity cost is an input cost for people who do most everything else. And then, secondarily, the question of how you price retail gasoline, I think, will remain a separate public policy decision.
But I have to tell you that most of the residential electricity in Mexico is subsidized. So don't expect the residents, the price of electricity in Mexico coming down for residential purposes. For industrial purposes, that's exactly the case, and it's very important, okay? A ver, allá. Perdón, íbamos a agarrar esta y luego aquella. Adelante.
Hello, my name is Mario Quintanilla. I study political science and international relations, and I have a question for Dr. Lipton. What has the IMF learned from the mistakes of the past regarding the conditionality of the structural adjustment policies without a case-by-case rationale, and how have those lessons shaped the way in which the fund now helps countries, particularly European ones, coming out of the Great Recession?
Excellent question. The fund has to learn from episode to episode. The fund, at the beginning of my time at the fund, was engaged in helping Latin America with the Latin American debt crisis of the 80s. And it probably learned a lot from that it then applied when the Eastern European countries all broke off from the Soviet Union. And it had to learn how to deal with economic transition, the transition from communism to capitalism. And then it had to learn again when the Mexican crisis happened and then the Asian crisis happened, what the role of rapid changes in capital markets and huge flows of capital were going to mean. And in all of those episodes, there were attempts to deal with macroeconomic problems and structural issues. The IMF decided in the wake of the Asian crisis that it really should stick as closely as it could to macroeconomic issues and only treat structural issues if they were so-called macrocritical. That was the phrase that was used. And that I think most people at the IMF were pretty comfortable with that until this crisis came along. And here we've found that there are some aspects of this crisis, and especially in the countries you mentioned, in the European cases, where structural issues are absolutely central to restoring macroeconomic stability. So while we, in a sense, tried to narrow our focus, we find that it's actually appropriate in some cases to, again, to broaden our focus. Say in Greece. Greece faced the challenge of trying to stay in the Eurozone while it had both huge budgetary problems, a bankrupt banking sector, and a very severe loss of competitiveness. But since, of course, it wasn't a country with its own money and its own central bank and exchange rate, it couldn't do anything through monetary and exchange rate policy. So the questions of, and they were questions of how to restore competitiveness, which is in essence a supply question, and stay within a monetary zone became an interesting and really quite challenging problem. So I guess all I can say is we do try to learn from past episodes. The main thing we've learned is that no crisis is really like the last, and there's a need to adjust approaches. We don't pretend always to get it right. Certainly not, I mean, to use a baseball metaphor, we don't necessarily believe we're ever going to hit the first pitch, but we're going to keep at it until we get it right.
Last question there.
Hi, my name is Katia Nolasco. I study economics here, and my question is basically, which policies is the IMF taking in order to unify economic development plus sustainability? I mean, how are you going to overcome the risks of overpopulation and the abuse of resources, but also without stopping the increase in the GDP, for example, or in general, the production?
Well, I hope all of you will study that and go on to get graduate degrees and apply for jobs at the IMF so you can help us figure out how to do that. We welcome your applications. That question is related to the earlier one. We are obviously finding in this new changing global environment that sustainability is an important matter. And not only that, it's a matter that many of our member countries care about. And we are branching out and looking at some of these subjects. We did a study a little over a year ago, that was rather novel for us. We were looking at the question of energy subsidies, and not just the kind of energy subsidies where the government might subsidize your home heating, but also what you might call the externalities, the fact that governments don't charge, for the most part, don't charge in the gasoline prices to take account of the cost of pollution or of ozone depletion, or even of the congestion costs in a city. This city, just driving around here for one day, one can see that there's a need to think about the question of traffic congestion. So we've done a study that looks worldwide at how energy policies could be improved in order to help make government finances more sustainable, and in the end as well to lead to greater sustainability in all these senses in terms of pollution, environmental degradation, climate change, congestion, etc. And I think we'll be continuing to branch out on this. There are a host of other related topics. The World Bank will take up the topics that are really more structural in nature, but where they are macro-critical, and we think energy subsidies is, we'll take them on.
Well, okay, thank you very much, Dr. Roubini, Dr. Lipton. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful panel. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to, just to bring this session to a close, I would like to express once again our gratitude. I think it's a very unique privilege to have the opportunity to have here with us a conversation with the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, to talk openly about the IMF, what the IMF is doing, its views about the world, about the region, about the country, and also joined by certainly one of the leading macroeconomics analysts in the globe. So thank you, David, thank you, Nouriel, thank you, Leo, for a fantastic job. Thank you very much. And just a small token of appreciation, and thank you very much. So please join me with ovation for you. Good night, thank you.